Okay. So welcome everyone to this webinar, the first webinar of ITSS Verona on Arctic security. Today we're going to be discussing NATO's enlargement to the north, but not only that. My name is Irene Senfter. I am the Arctic Desk Lead at ITSS Verona, and I'm a PhD candidate at King's College London. So before we start today and before I introduce our guests, I would just like to tell you why I think that studying the Arctic is important. The Arctic's relevance goes beyond what we read in the media. It's not just a strategic place or the new frontier, but it is a rich and fertile ground for relations between all types of actors at all levels. So between governments, local councils, scientists, diplomats, NGOs, indigenous peoples, associations, think tanks, multinational companies. And they all interact on a spectrum that goes from competition to cooperation on a multiplicity of non-traditional and traditional security issues. So it's very fascinating to me. We also need to know that there is not just one Arctic. There are many Arctics. There is the North American Arctic, there's the European Arctic, there's the Russian Arctic, and they all have their own sets of specific opportunities and challenges and strategic outlooks. But they also share some transnational security interests, such as environmental protection and maritime security. And there's 4 million people living in the Arctic. Many of them are indigenous people, and they have a right to live and thrive in their homeland. So sustainable development is an important topic. So many security dynamics happen first in the Arctic, and those dynamics have implications on other regions and on the planet at large. So to me, studying the Arctic really means both looking ahead and collecting important lessons. So on that note, I will introduce our guests today. We have Dr. Gabriella Gricius. She's a research associate at the Arctic Institute and fellow and media coordinator at the North American and Arctic Defense and Security Network. Hello, Gabriella. Welcome. Then we have Pavel Devyatkin. He's a senior associate at the Arctic Institute and a visiting lecturer at HSE University at Moscow. Hello, Pavel. And we have our very own Marco Dordoni. He's an analyst at ITSS Verona's Arctic Desk, and he's a PhD candidate at Università per Stranieri di Perugia. Hi, Marco. So welcome, everyone. Thank you for being here today. Let's start the conversation with Marco and his view on NATO's enlargement. Marco, in your PhD work, you're analyzing NATO's role in the Arctic. We are now marking 1 year since Sweden's and Finland's accession to NATO, following a deterioration in East-West relations due to Russia's invasion of Ukraine. Which strategic and operational developments for NATO allies in the north have you seen unfolding since this accession? And what role do non-Arctic NATO states play in this changing strategic environment?
Yeah, hello. And good evening. Thank you, Irene, for this kind introduction and this really interesting question. I would take a moment to extend my gratitude to the ITSS team for organizing this timely and interesting event and including me among the speakers. And I would like also to thank Dr. Gricius and Mr. Devyatkin. It's always a pleasure for me to discuss these topics with such esteemed speakers. So coming back to your question, I would like to break my answer into 2 parts. First, I'll talk about what has changed from a strategic point of view, so the first part of your question, and then I'll move on to practical and operational impacts of Sweden and Finland joining NATO in the Arctic region. So let me start to the strategically point of view. So the inclusion of 2 more Arctic states into NATO has clearly shifted NATO's focus and strategic compass toward the high north. This shift is largely due to the fact that the main threat to NATO comes from that region, because the European Arctic could represent, for example, such as a potential Achilles heel for the alliance, both in the event of an Article 5 activation, but also in the case of a direct confrontation with Russia. And in this specific topic, there is still is a significant gap in military and capabilities and also preparedness compared to Russia. So this strategic reorientation towards high north is really important, but is reflected also in a recent NATO's documents, starting with 2022 strategic concept, for example. But the importance of the high north into strategic documents has been increasingly emphasized, culminating in the most recent strategic documents, where it is clearly identified the high north as a strategic priority for NATO. For example, just a few days ago, the new NATO Secretary General visited the Norwegian Arctic, underlying in his speech once again the relevance of this area for NATO's future strategy. And so the accession of Sweden and Finland has greatly contributed to this shift, for sure. And strategically, it has reinforced NATO northern flank, but also creating a stronger connection that maybe before missed between the Arctic and the Baltic regions. So two different regions where Russia retains the abilities to strike. So if we look at recent developments, also highlights a growing link between the war in Ukraine and the European Arctic, making the securitization of Finland border the largest shared Russia really critical for the alliance. So when analyzing the accession, when we move the focus and we analyze the accession of Sweden and Finland from an operational perspective, so the other side of my answer, the approach is quite different, because while there are clear advantages that always underline in the public documents or in the public speech, such as their ability to enhance the technological level of capabilities and their strong preparedness for operations in the cold weather and extreme conditions, we should not underestimate the strategic identity of these two countries. Sweden and Finland, despite having vast northern territories, are primarily Baltic-oriented rather than Arctic. And operationally, their defense structures and military planning have historically been focused on securing the Baltic region, not the Arctic. And this is very different. For example, however, the Baltic Sea and Arctic Ocean differ greatly in their, for example, characteristics. One has deep waters, and the others, for example, is characterized by shallow waters. And this point of view and these differences are difficult also operational. So this is something underestimated, but in my point of view, really important. And also from the last testimonials and interviews that I had with the Swedish and Finnish are the most hard points to overcome after 1 year of the enlargement. like to moving to the second part of your question about the role of non-Arctic NATO states into Arctic region. I think is increasingly significant, also because Arctic security is no longer a matter limited to the regional actors, but has become more a strategic issue for entire alliance and affects the survival and cohesion of entire alliance, an existential threat not for just 8 states of the alliance, as 7 states of the alliance, but for whole. Also, something really important is the 360 degree approach that also involves this concept. And among the most actively involved countries, for example, there is United Kingdom, which due to its geographic position and strategic interests has a strong stake in a stable INORF. And for this reason, the UK is contributing valuable naval and submarine expertise to enhance NATO's presence and capabilities in the region. But also, for example, Germany is also playing a growing role into region, particularly through its close cooperation with Norway, also in submarine domain, but also naval and air domain. The Netherlands also brings important expertise, for example, in particular in the air domain, in drones technologies. That is really important in this type of war. And last but not least, also Italy is strengthening its position in the Arctic affairs and is set to formalize maybe next year its strategic engagement in the region through an upcoming strategic document. So yeah, I think this is my overview about this really interesting question. So I hope to give an satisfied answer to your question.
Yeah, no, very, very good. It's interesting the differences that you mentioned between Nordic countries. It's not the same for we always say the Nordics, but there's differences in between those countries too. So that's very interesting. Talking about threats, one type of threat that is written about much in the media and in analysis are hybrid threats in the Arctic, which are defined as conventional and non-conventional tactics below the threshold of formal state-level aggression. So my question is my second question to you is about those hybrid threats. How do these tactics that are often attributed to Russia and China fit into the picture of growing tensions in East-West relations and NATO's engagement in the Arctic?
Yeah, another really important and also huge question, but I'm trying to be brief, also to receive some feedback and comments from audience. That is always important and fruitful. Yeah, in my view, a non-conventional conflict between Russia and NATO is already underway. So already something ongoing. For example, also the really last news about the drones that struck on Russian territory just a few days ago, hitting also 2 Arctic military bases, one in Siberia, if I'm not wrong, and another one really important in the Kola Peninsula, are a clear indication of this dynamic. So both hybrid threats, because are not conventional, but also Arctic region into hybrid threats. And so, yeah, I think traditional conventional warfare, where 2 opposing forces confront each other directly, is likely outdated and extremely costly in both financial and logistical terms, for example. So I see hybrid threats on allow, for example, the actor to weaken its adversary with lower cost and risk, but also really, really important point in my view, with hybrid threats, they operate in such a gray zone, blurring the line between accidental incidents and deliberate attacks, and also really difficult to identify or react to this kind of threats. So yeah, also an example of this is a growing concern over the vulnerability of undersea cables, mainly in Baltic Sea, but I can see also the Arctic region gradually more exposed in this particular topic, because, for example, the planned construction of critical infrastructures such as fiber optic cables, like through Arctic Ocean, and the growing development of Arctic shipping routes, maybe the likely one, so the Northern Sea route, but also the other two, that is something going on and developing also in Canadian coast, but also the transpolar route that can cut into different part of the Arctic. So I think hybrid threats is something really, really important for the war of the future, but is also really important for the Arctic. So this is precisely why NATO and its Nordic members are working on developing technologies and capabilities aimed at protecting and defending these key infrastructures, for example, and essential also to really, really important, because this infrastructure, like fiber cables and many others undersea, are really important for our economies and stabilities and security systems. So in short, to answer to your question, I can say absolutely yes. Yeah, Arctic will be gradually more and more a target for hybrid attacks and threats. In particular, from Russian side, I can see maybe using shadow fleet or other kind of way, blurring with fleet to cut cables, or cyber attacks, or striking critical infrastructures with the new technologies in missiles. But yeah, I can see that hybrid threat is something really, really important, and also why NATO are like trying to develop and to boost its preparation on that.
Yeah, thank you, Marco. See what this develops. Thank you for these insights. We now turn to Pavel. Pavel is our expert on Russia's Arctic policy and diplomacy and US-Russia relations. Pavel, you're currently based in Moscow, and you're deeply familiar with Russia's strategic culture, so we are looking forward to hear from you. Russia is now facing 7 NATO states in the Arctic, which is a territory that is critical to its national security. And there have been discussions on whether enlarging NATO to the north would further antagonize Russia in a region that has always been seeking stable East-West relations. So what has been Russia's response in terms of strategy and posture to this NATO enlargement in the north?
Yes, thank you very much, Irene. Also, I'd like to say thank you to the organizers of this meeting. I'm very happy to be with Marco and Gabriella, very knowledgeable experts. So really happy to also hear comments from the audience on these topics. It's a very important question. Finland and Sweden's leadership connected their moves to join NATO to the war in Ukraine. So very much the question is, how has Russia's Arctic strategy and posture changed after the war in Ukraine? But also they are separate discussions at the same time when we look at specific rhetoric regarding Finland and Sweden in the Arctic from a Russian perspective. I think it's good to give an outline of Russia's Arctic security policy and that can be summarized as with goals related to protecting Russia's sovereignty in the region, to securing Russia's economic interests, including natural resources and plans for shipping routes, and to demonstrate that Russia remains a great power with first-rate military capabilities. So, very much so, Russia's Arctic security policy is especially Putin's Arctic security policy is rooted in defensiveness and pessimism as well regarding cooperation and relations with especially the West. In comparison to other Russian leaders like Dmitry Medvedev and Mikhail Gorbachev, who had more progressive and idealistic, optimistic views on Arctic security and cooperation, their policies could be likened to a belief in a narrative of Arctic exceptionalism of the region as a very special part of the world where cooperation is possible and could possibly even avert conflict. In comparison to those leaders, Putin is much more pessimistic and defensive in his Arctic security policy. And so we see that in developments in Russia's Arctic strategy, in rhetoric and updates, amendments to Russia's official Arctic strategy since the start of the war in Ukraine, but also in the context of Finland and Sweden joining NATO. At the same time, it's interesting to emphasize that when Finland and Sweden made their applications to join NATO, Putin actually first said Russia has no problems with these states and that there is no immediate threat. There in Russian mass media and popular analysis, there was the view that Finland and Sweden joining NATO were going to be security threats, but instead Putin emphasized that Russia's problem with new members in NATO was more connected to Ukraine. Putin spoke about how the West had been turning Ukraine into an anti-Russian stronghold for many years, targeting Russian speakers in Ukraine, Russian culture in Ukraine, but this was not happening in Finland or Sweden. The memory of World War II is very bright in Russian policymaking. Famously, Nazi Germany invaded the Soviet Union, including through Ukraine. But also the same could be said about our other countries in the Nordics. So during World War II, Nazi Germany, together with Finland, invaded Russia through the Arctic as part of the Nazi Operation Silver Fox, and this was part of the World War II. Yes. So in terms of how Russia regards Finland and Sweden in terms of security dialogue, it's interesting that some experts distinguish between the Baltic states and Poland on one hand, and the Scandinavian countries on the other hand. So the Baltic states and Poland, as already having developed and developing military strongholds against Russia with their own distinct histories of relations with Russia, a country's that used to be part of the Russian Empire and Soviet Union. And then on the other hand, the Scandinavian countries, which also have their long and complicated histories with Russia, but can be regarded as potentially balanced and cooperative in relation to Russia. So some Russian experts have noted that There's a certain Nordic mentality that's open to cooperation, openness to constructiveness, and interest in conflict resolution. So this was especially noted of Norway, and so the joining of Finland and Sweden to NATO could be a potential continuation of a Norwegian-like mentality towards NATO-Russia relations. So this means that you look at how Norway is a founding NATO member. Norway has imposed harsh sanctions on Russia. Norway has hosted some of the largest NATO military exercises since the end of the Cold War. But at the same time, Norway keeps its land and sea border open with Russia. So Norwegian-Russian relations are almost all Arctic relations because of the concentration in the Barents Sea. Norway continues to co-manage the fisheries in the Barents Sea, one of the world's largest fish stock in the world, and so on and so on. There are many other examples of continuation in Norwegian-Russian cooperation, communication, and dialogue. Those kind of examples could also apply to Finland and Sweden. That was the thinking at the start of the integration of Finland into Sweden into NATO. But at the same time, Finland and Sweden joining NATO also legitimizes Russian defensive measures. So Russian experts have for a long time argued that it's Western analysts and commentators that have criticized Russia's militarization of the Arctic, but now recent developments show that in fact it is the Western Arctic states that are militarizing the Arctic. So this more recently has been seen as an increased perceived threat from Russia, and in recent speeches, for example, in Murmansk in March of this year, Putin announced that the number of military personnel in the Arctic would be increased. Other Russian officials have also noted the increase of military activity of NATO member states in the Arctic, and that they will contribute to the growth of conflict potential in the region. The commander-in-chief of the Russian Navy has said that NATO countries are increasing their military activity, practicing for conflict in difficult climatic conditions. And so we are seeing military and security officials also express pessimism, but also diplomats. Russia's top Arctic diplomat, Vladislav Maslenikov, also noted that the US is deepening its military cooperation in the Arctic with new and old NATO members. Maslenikov is the head of a department in the Ministry of Foreign Affairs of Russia that used to be called the Department for Pan-European Cooperation. Now that department is called the Department for Pan-European Problems. So even from a diplomatic perspective, we're seeing pessimism. Pessimism about increases in military activity close to Russia, regular visits by American nuclear submarines to Northern European ports, more frequent flights by NATO strategic aviation. In general, there is a geopolitical aspect to these concerns because the Arctic is Russia's northern border. So there are economic projects there, and there's this desire to maintain a great power status, but essentially the Arctic is Russia's entire northern border. So when there are exercises and discussions of encroaching on Russian territory or disagreements over Russian control over maritime and land territories in the Arctic, we see this as very sensitive from a security perspective to Russia. So I'll stop right there. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you, Pavel. That sounds like there's some potential for escalation, but we'll see how this goes. Pavel, now the question that you're always getting in the waiting room, you told me that that's the number one question that you're getting from your students in Moscow about US-Russia relations. President Putin and President Trump have moved closer somehow recently, and they have talked about joint investment projects to develop the Russian Arctic. So what is your take on this rapprochement between the US and Russia in Arctic affairs, diplomacy, cooperation? And do you think we will witness any changes in Arctic governance?
Yes, definitely. So, the short answer is we are likely to see an increase in bilateralism over multilateralism. So that means, we're talking about US-Russia rapprochement. We're not talking about Russia-West rapprochement. The European Union, the European states in the Arctic Council, Canada as well, are not involved in this US-Russia rapprochement. So that has implications for Arctic governance. This has implications for Denmark's Arctic Council chairmanship. Not only Trump's threats against Denmark to seize or annex Greenland, notwithstanding military or economic coercion, also threatens this situation. But in terms of U.S.-Russia rapprochement, we're seeing opportunities. We're seeing rhetoric over natural resources, rare earth minerals especially, oil and gas projects, and we even saw some discussion of perhaps even shipping cooperation, which I'm not sure about how shipping cooperation could develop between the U.S. and Russia, but rare earth minerals, oil and gas, and other areas of business seems to be where U.S. and Russian policymakers and businessmen are very interested. So over the past few months, I've spoken to many diplomats and businessmen here in Moscow, also with people abroad, and we're seeing very big interest in the Arctic region. Concern for climate change is at a minimum. That Trump is representing a climate skeptic administration. We saw his Secretary of Defense say the Pentagon doesn't deal with climate BS. We're seeing the Trump administration delete climate data from government websites and purging ongoing scientific projects of words like climate change and environmental justice. But at the same time, from the Russian side, we saw some Russian officials mention that climate change will be an essential part of US-Russia cooperation in the Arctic. So we are attention should especially be paid to the Russian official Kirill Dmitriev. He's the CEO of the Russian Direct Investment Fund and is Putin's envoy. He has visited Washington and is corresponding and meeting with Trump's envoy, Steve Witkoff. And so Kirill Dmitriev, specifically when he was there at the first meeting between US Secretary of State Marco Rubio and Russian Foreign Minister Sergei Lavrov in Saudi Arabia, he mentioned that the US and Russia need to cooperate in the Arctic in joint projects, and that Russian representatives have already started to propose collaboration in economic projects with their American counterparts. Kirill Dmitriev made that comment about climate change as a key area of cooperation between the US and Russia in the Arctic at the International Arctic Forum in Murmansk in March. He made that comment to the BBC. We also see discussions of a revamping of diplomatic relations, so the restoration of staff to diplomatic missions, and this would significantly reduce obstacles to US-Russia communications, cooperation, exchanges, and other collaborations. So this would make it easier for Russian and American scientists, for example, to issue visas, to receive visas, to conduct international exchanges. And this is a small glimpse of hope, because Russians and Americans have a long history of polar science cooperation, and it could even go back centuries. Even during the Cold War, at the height of ideological confrontation, there were still high-level agreements or diplomacy for science that focused on ecological problems in the Arctic. At the end of the Cold War, when the Iron Curtain came down, American and Western researchers that lacked access to the Soviet Arctic now poured into the Russian Arctic, and there were many bilateral and multilateral projects that saw very important joint findings related to climate change adaptation, mitigation, that allowed the creation of important prognoses and models for understanding how the Arctic climate crisis is unfolding. But since 2022 and the pause in institutionalized Arctic cooperation, Biden's termination of science and technological cooperation with Russia, American, Western, and Russian scientists have all bemoaned and criticized the state of polar research collaboration. That to study Arctic climate change without understanding what's going on in the Russian sector of the Arctic does not create complete and comprehensive climate models. One scientist even said that to study Arctic climate change without data from Russia is like driving a car, taking two wheels off, and then trying to drive home. So it doesn't make sense, and that's why these developments in U.S.-Russia rapprochement have many benefits, not only for the potential for cooperation that could enable crucial scientific cooperation, but also this area, this form of trust building and cooperation could also spill over into other areas that are crucial, perhaps the most crucial of which being arms control and nuclear non-proliferation. And after the attacks over the weekend on Russia's strategic bombers, we're seeing that as an especially crucial situation. So in terms of U.S.-Russia cooperation, we're right now in practice, we're probably in the short term to see something in the areas of oil and gas and natural resources, but we're also hoping that climate change is not ignored in this rapprochement. And perhaps it's even the responsibility of academics, NGOs, and activists to make sure, and indigenous peoples and scientists to make sure that climate change is not forgotten in this rapprochement. Indeed, it was those non-state actors that pushed the US and USSR during the Cold War to pay attention to these crucial ecological issues, and who drew attention to the transformation of the Arctic. So perhaps some negative developments, but also there is room for some hope here.
Well, thank you, Pavel. You're leading me beautifully over to Gabriella's questions. Perfect. Yeah, thank you for this. So we see bilateralism and transactionalism, which is arguably the new foreign policy of Trump. Anyway, thank you, Pavel. Gabriella, we have been talking mostly about defense issues, even if Pavel has already touched upon climate change and other non-traditional issues. But let's now talk about Arctic developments from a different angle. And I have a couple of questions for you. Morten Haglund, who until recently has been the head of the senior Arctic officials at the Arctic Council, has said in his acceptance speech of the Northern Hero Award that security is sucking the air out of the room. And he refers to defense matters taking center stage over security issues that affect the daily lives of people living in the Arctic and of the health of the planet. So my question is, how do you assess those non-traditional security developments in light of this increased military focus that we have discussed today? And what are the implications for sustainable development in this? And my main question would also be, what is your main concern for the future of the Arctic?
So thank you, Irene, so much for the invitation and for ITSS, and also to hear the great contributions of Marco and Pavel. Always great to join you all in discussion. I certainly agree with Martin that military security issues have really quickly taken center stage in the Arctic, while many issues involving environmental and human security have largely fallen to the wayside. This is, of course, not to say that NATO enlargement in the Arctic and Russian foreign policy in the Arctic aren't really important aspects of taking a nuanced understanding of the issue. But, we also can't afford to ignore non-traditional security concerns. As you mentioned, environmental and human security specifically are really central to the daily lives of people living in the Arctic. So just walking us through an environmental and then human security approach. From an environmental perspective, things are continually quite grim. So the most recent AMAP report, which is the Arctic Monitoring and Assessment Program working group as part of the Arctic Council, just came out with an Arctic climate change update just a few weeks ago that has some pretty alarming numbers about how things have developed in the region from 1979 to 2023. So, as of course most of us know, the Arctic has been warming at 3 times the pace of the rest of the world. But beyond just that, kind of broad picture statement here, what we also have to understand is that there's also more extreme weather events and that wildfires, something that, were quite rare in the past, are becoming increasingly common. The cryosphere, so the area that encompasses glaciers, ice caps, ice sheets, permafrost, as well as sea, land ice, and snow, is also shrinking at an alarming rate, which of course has serious impacts for indigenous communities as well as Arctic ecosystems. So, just as one example, from 1979 to 2023, sea ice has decreased by 58% across the region. Of course, ice loss is at an all-time high, but so too is sea level rise correspondingly. And the Arctic Ocean is also acidifying at 3 to 4 times the rate of the rest of the world, which has then impacts for the food security of indigenous people, coastal communities, and also marine life. Shifting them to a human security perspective, we're also seeing a lot of those downstream impacts of climate change, like what I just mentioned, having significant impacts on those living in the region. So food security as one particular area is specifically a problem. But if we broaden the aperture a bit, we can also look at troubling health security patterns in the Arctic. So there are high rates of suicide, for example, especially among Arctic youth, indigenous, and otherwise. There's a large infrastructure gap in most Arctic countries' northern regions versus their southern parts. And of course, gas access and power access for many people who don't have the same type of accessibility that we might have in the non-Arctic parts of the world. So as we focus more and more on military security issues, that means resources and attention are correspondingly shifting towards these areas as well. What are the implications then for dealing with just on a focus on military security versus environmental and human? Of course, this means that all we hear about is military security. So when we look at the BBC, for example, or other news organizations, there's been a rise in a lot of headlines in the news where we see the Arctic scramble, great powers competing for competition in the Arctic resources, these traditional tropes and narratives that we hear all the time. And we see so little mention now of this more nuanced perspective of security. And so to your question about sustainable development, I think my kind of follow-up question is sustainable development for whom and for what purpose? I think that there actually will be a rise in sustainable development in the Arctic, but that it will be from a military perspective. So the development of roads, for example, for shifting more land-based resources or infrastructure, but built primarily for military needs rather than for the people living there. And also then the question becomes development between which countries? So we may see more sustainable development between Russia and China, for example, and like the other like-minded 7 Arctic states, but are we seeing more development between them? I think this is certainly not the default setting. We can get around some of these issues by recentering our focus on the transnational security issues that affect everyone in the Arctic, which is my main concern for the Arctic's future is climate change, and that we risk kind of sidelining that issue by over talking about military security and great power competition, although of course this is a really important part of the discussion.
Yeah, thank you, Gabriella. I really like this question that you're asking, sustainable development for whom? That is a really good question, yeah. My next question is another one of those questions that experts, Arctic experts, especially North American Arctic experts, are getting all the time about Greenland. President Trump has recently and often expressed his interest to acquire control of Greenland, which is a self-ruled autonomous territory part of the Kingdom of Denmark. And this has sparked attention not only of political leaders and academic community, security community, the media, of course, but also of civil society and the public at large worldwide. So my question is there a way we can reframe this Greenland story that we hear about all the time from one of strategic necessity to one of climate change urgency, which a little bit you have talked about this already before? And yeah, this was let me see. And the larger question that I have for you is how can the academic and the scientific community, and along with the civil society, take back this Arctic discourse on where the Arctic is heading and what needs to be done to safeguard the Arctic?
Yeah, so thank you for the question. I think it is certainly possible to reframe this Greenland story from just strategic competition to also climate change urgency. But it requires a really deliberate shift led by those who know the region best. So, I think when we think about Greenland kind of in a background, it's long been talked about as a strategic prize, whether to do with its important military positioning, critical minerals that are on Greenland, as well as great power leverage. But of course, this really ignores the lived experiences of Greenlanders and the reality of climate vulnerability on the ground. So, for two examples, there are two polls that came out within the last couple years that survey Greenlanders, asking them, what are the largest threats to your security? And so rather than, many of these individuals talking about China or Russia or the United States, instead they're focused on climate change, housing availability, economic issues. And so to my mind, this means that we should be following the lead of Greenlandic as well as indigenous political leaders who are already pushing to reframe this narrative. And they've emphasized that it is climate change and other environmental and security issues that are central for Greenland's future, rather than only geopolitical competition. But how can the community really take back the discussion of where the Arctic is headed? I think to start, this begins with focusing on academics and experts and making sure that they are not uncritically reproducing narratives that frame Greenland and the Arctic only as theaters of great power competition. And that includes being particularly careful about areas like critical minerals or strategic shipping routes without context. So, I think if we only talk about these things in the lens of great power competition, it's easy to understand how these narratives form about the region as being this site of conflict. Whereas we might take a broader view here and say, the Northern Sea Route is critical for Russia's national economic security, not only for, in the lens of shipping competition or cooperation, but it's important for Russia in of itself. Similarly, for Greenland, critical minerals might represent a future pathway for more economic independence, but that comes with an economic and environmental cost towards building the capacity to mine these resources. What's also a really important part of taking back the discourse is actively myth busting. So challenging voices external to the Arctic that try to speak over local ones and try to shape the narrative from the outside. And so I mentioned in my previous answer a couple of those myths. So this question of the Arctic scramble, that the Arctic is just a place in which great powers scramble for power. A second myth to myth bust might be that the Arctic is unilaterally becoming more accessible. Certainly, climate change is making certain parts of the Arctic more accessible, but it's not happening in a linear way. And it's not happening in a way that, is constantly making that more economically accessible for outside entities. And then the third myth to myth bust might be that the Arctic is becoming militarized. There is more military activity in the Arctic. That is, unquestioned. There are more exercises, more potential connections to the war in Ukraine. but it is not becoming a militarized region by default. That's a choice that we make in how we talk about and what areas we focus on in the Arctic discussion. And then the third thing that I would want to draw our attention to is that really supporting, again, indigenous people and those living in the Arctic to set the agenda and not just responding to it. So rather than just including these actors as token actors here, that they need to actually be part of the discussion and decision-making bodies. And so broadly, the future of the Arctic shouldn't be just determined by political leaders, but rather it should reflect the needs, values, and knowledge of Arctic communities that know the region best. So reclaiming these narratives is part of that we can do in of ourselves as a civil society community, but also by supporting actors that have the most authority to speak on these issues.
Thank you, Gabriella. That was very clear. Yeah, a good policy suggestion here to listen to who lives there. Yeah, who feels it on their skin, what is going on. Yeah. Thank you. We have now, I think, 10-15 minutes left, depending on how much time our experts have for questions. Questions from the audience. So you may raise your hand and you just unmute yourself and ask your question, or you can type it into the chat box and I will read it out for you. I hope we'll have some questions. Go ahead, please, audience. Yes, please. A name I cannot pronounce. Please go ahead and tell me how you pronounce your name, please.
My name is Guðbjörg Ríkey Hauksdóttir, but most people call me Ríkey.
Okay,
And
Ríkey,
thank you all so much for your presentations. I really find your point, Gabriella, about the myths so interesting. So we have seen so many clickbaits recently about the Arctic from big media companies, especially here in the US. So what can we do to counter these myths that seem to be perpetuated throughout the media and that there is a scramble on there? What can we do?
I can respond. Okay. I think, and this pains me to say this as someone who enjoys being an introvert, I think it does mean, as people who have knowledge of the Arctic region, to being just much more willing to go out, willing to take interview requests, willing to write pieces where we're very clear about, there's nuance, there's context that needs to be taken into account when we are thinking about this region. And so I think just being a lot more active on social media, more traditional media, taking those steps to making sure that when we see these myths, we are able to respond to it very quickly and make sure that, individuals that might be reading it have a different set of viewpoints as well to consider.
Thank you.
Thank you, Gabriella. And another question? Do we have someone else? Yeah, please, Martina.
Hi. Do you hear me properly?
Yes.
Okay, perfect. So thank you very much for your words, thank you very much to the speakers. I joined the meeting because I have a genuine interest in the Arctic and specifically on Sino-Russian cooperation in this area. So I think overall we can say that the Sino-Russian partnership is quite of very divisive matter because analysts divide into skeptics and believers. So I would simply ask, I would like to ask, what's your take on this cooperation? If there are actually limits, because on the one hand, we can see joint drills also next to Alaska. On the other hand, limits to cooperation in light of US threats of sanctions and sanctions. So, yeah, simply what's your take, maybe Marco and Pavel?
I would ask Pavel maybe. Yeah, Pavel is an expert on US-China Russia relations. So let's hear from him. I have another question for Marco then. So Marco, don't worry and get ready for your question. Pavel, please.
Yes, thank you very much, Martina, for your question. I think, yeah, you're right to characterize that there is a controversy in Arctic studies on, what is the nature of the Sino-Russian partnership. But this is not just in Arctic studies, but in other regions and other areas. I would say, it's helpful to be nuanced. It doesn't have to be black or white. It's good to notice and important to notice the evidence of both strengths in the Russian-Chinese cooperation and challenges. So you probably know that there's no official alliance between Russia and China, but policymakers from their countries have called their relationship a comprehensive strategic partnership. China has a mutual defense treaty with only one country, which is North Korea. Russia has a similar defense pact with North Korea as of last year, and many other defense agreements such as the CSTO. But Russia and China do not have an official alliance. They don't have a mutual defense treaty. In terms of the Arctic, you probably already know about how China is interested in the Arctic for economic reasons and for natural resources, and so has been a partner to Russia in many of Russia's hydrocarbon projects in the Arctic. China has announced its plans for a polar Silk Road. China has also filled the gap in many research projects together with Russia after Russia was isolated from the Arctic Council and other Arctic cooperative arrangements that influence scientific cooperation. Growing ties between Russia and China have been developing since even before the ongoing war in Ukraine. So it should not just be regarded as a consequence of sanctions, but should be seen as as a part of a larger geoeconomic project that you can call it BRICS, you can call it the Greater Eurasian Partnership. That we see numerous official joint statements from Russia and China on their ties increasing. But you're right to notice that there are challenges. We've been talking about how the Northern Sea route is very important for Russia's economic development, and China has a different interpretation of many of Russia's maritime territories from a legal perspective. China's perspective is closer to that of the U.S. of leaning towards an internationalization of Arctic waters. So this has been noticed not just in Western commentary, but also among Russian experts who are skeptical of China's temporary business interests, and draw attention to China not really fulfilling its large plans for its so-called Polar Silk Road. So we see that shipping from China has decreased after the war in Ukraine, especially the Chinese Overseas Shipping Company stopped its shipping in part because of a fear of secondary sanctions from the West. But just to round up, it's good to have a nuanced perspective on this question, because at the highest levels, at the leaders levels, at the levels of ministers, at the between the leading businessmen of the two countries, we are seeing very high level cooperation, and cooperation between Russia and China are not going to decrease but increase.
If I may comment and make a comment, not on Pavel, but just to answer to Martina question about NATO perspective on that. Like the last strategic documents, I highlighted that there is three threats. One, the main one is like Russia, China, and Russian-China cooperation. But on the point of view and the strategic compass of NATO, it's towards Russia, also because United States has not a lot of interest that NATO will interfere in a kind of way into the pivot interest of United States, that is China and South China Sea, like this. Just
thank you, Pavel and Marco.
Thank you. Do we have any other questions from the audience? If not, I would ask a last. Here you have. Oh no, this is okay. Let me see what Ava is writing. Okay, a question for Gabriella we have from Ava. With different military exercises happening in the Arctic, how would you suggest advocating for some of the military-focused actors to integrate human security, food security, sustainable development for more than just military purposes into their exercises?
That's a very good question. I think it really depends per country. So I think it's hard to make a blanket statement about how different military actors could do this, because I think in some cases, for example, in Canada, there is a very close relationship between the Canadian military and, of course, the Canadian Rangers. But I think that is likely different across different parts of the European Arctic. Perhaps one suggestion might be that for particular types of investment in different parts of the Arctic, there might be a corresponding investment for different human security issues. For the United States, I can't say specifically about what they're doing with perhaps any Alaska Natives in terms of their exercises, but in terms of a policy suggestion, I think it might be a good idea, again, just to tandem up on investment. If we are choosing to invest in particular military aspects, it should be doubled when it comes to dealing with environmental and human security issues. Of course, given the current US administration's perspective on climate change, that might need to be framed or couched in different terms, perhaps rather than climate change, addressing some of the real ways that weather changes have impacts on military operations in the Arctic, and thinking about this through a more operational perspective that would be allowed then to encompass more human and environmental issues.
Thank you, Gabriella. Someone just arrived a little late. Do we have any other question from the audience? Otherwise, I will ask my question of Marco, and then I think we'll need to stop. We're running a little bit over. Marco, we have been talking about the rapprochement between the US and Russia, but let's also talk about this other hot topic about a potential retreat of the US from NATO's deterrence and defense system in Europe. What would be the implication for NATO's strategy or posture in the Arctic?
Yeah, thank you. A really interesting and timely question. No, like I'm aspiring on the last interviews that I led in these last few days. Yeah, I think it's really important to understand what it means about United States retreat in a strategical point of view again and operational point of view, because yeah, the narrative of Trump it's clear, and I think there are many goals that Trump has to reach through this aggressive and this really direct narrative. But on the other side, there is also operational point of view. And in operational point of view, like this narrative, this political narrative, are not been on the has not been on the field right now, because Americans are continuing to plan exercitation, next exercitation into NATO, also to cooperate with Danish armies. Yeah, but for sure, it's a really important topic, and maybe will become more and more important. But I think it's something related to a concept of trust more than operational point of view, because this kind of narrative of Trump's that Trump is leading, not affecting the operational point of view, because in the Arctic region it is almost the same as before, because American is really important for Arctic security, but more like in a trust. So like creating kind of distrust, also in also exchange data, maybe also yeah, collaborative operations. That is really really important in the Arctic, and especially in this moment. So I think the trust in this international relations environment are something that could be most focused on this concept of trust. And if Trump want to securitize Arctic and Arctic region and European Arctic, I think this political narrative it's evident that has no result on that so far. Yeah.
Okay. Thank you, Marco. Thank you, Marco, and thank you to all our experts. I think we're going to close here, so we're almost on time. Thank you for your insight. Thank you for being here today. I have learned a lot, and I think we all take home a lot. Thank you to our audience for your time, for your questions, for your attention. And thank you to ITSS Verona for providing us with a platform to talk about important Arctic issues. I am also supposed to bring my greetings from Michele Groppi, Dr. Michele Groppi. He's our president at ITSS Verona, and he has supported me very much in establishing this Arctic desk. So thank you again. I wish you all a nice evening, afternoon, morning, depending on where you're based. And we might see each other at the next ITSS webinar. Thank you very much. Bye-bye.
Thank you. Bye.
Everyone.